Syria being such a close ally of Iran, being an enemy of Israel, has put it on a blacklist. It is not the Syrian regime's human rights records which worried the United States, but this political role that Syria has played in terms of its alliance with Iran and its role in terms of supplying arms to Lebanon and to Palestinians in Gaza, and its opposition to U.S. presence in Iraq. So you have a situation there where, in fact, the democratic opposition in Syria had similar foreign policy politics to the Syrian regime. And that is significant, that the United States could not support the democratic forces within Syria, because the historically democratic forces in Syria, whose leaders have been in and out of jails for decades and being tortured in prisons, have similar foreign policy ambitions as the Syrian regime itself in terms of the relationship to Palestinians, to opposition to U.S. occupation of Iraq, and so on. They are on the record and publicly so. So the United States chose, in that sense, to support these extremist religious organizations and to supply them with arms. I started by talking about David Cameron's speech and how we are now paradoxically fighting so-called terrorism. Some of it is real terrorism in Mali and Algeria and in Libya and so on. But somehow we managed to also support and supply the terrorists of Syria. There is an important lesson there, that this. There is a book by Mark Curtis, recently published, about Britain's links to Islamic movements in the Middle East. I highly recommend everybody to read it. This will throw some light about the relationship between extremist, socially at least, extremist religious movements in the Middle East and big powers, especially United States, Britain, and France as well. So we have a picture that of the Middle East, which is at variance from what the media in general tell us. The conflict in Syria is, I think, so strategic that 10, 15 years down the line, if these major powers are not careful, could even lead us to World War type conflicts because of the critical nature of the Middle East, of its importance that I talked about initially. Russia, China, and Iran have decided that Syria is the line that they would not allow the United States to cross. They have allowed it in Iraq, they have allowed it in Libya, but they have decided to draw a line in Syria. Because if Syria goes, Lebanon might go, the whole of Palestine might go, and Iran will be attacked, and then they'll have a situation where they'll be in direct confrontation with NATO forces. China is critical for the future because of its rise as a major economic power. Its GDP will bypass that of the United States within the next 5 to 10 years. And its activities in Africa and across the world worry the United States enormously. You could see already a shift in U.S. policy towards the South China Sea and encouraging Japan to assert its claims to islands disputed with China. Similarly, an alliance now emerging between, paradoxical again, United States and Vietnam over islands that are disputed between China and Vietnam. There is a a lot of activity in that region, which is worth monitoring. But the Middle East is now the friction point between the big powers and the regional powers. Syria broke up relations, close relations, not diplomatic, with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was the main financier of Syria under Hafez Assad's regime, the father of Bashar Assad. That alliance broke up, and Iran replaced Saudi Arabia as the main backer, financial and otherwise, of Syria, Syria being relatively poor, although it has quite a lively and active light industry, producing clothes, food industry is quite advanced in Syria and so on. So although not oil-rich, economically it's quite an engine within the light industry framework in the Middle East. Standard of living is not as poor as some countries in the Middle East. The Gulf states are extremely worried, and they started pumping support for these organizations in Syria because of the spread of the uprisings to Bahrain. Bahrain is the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, the U.S. Fifth Fleet. So the United States asked the Saudi tanks and forces to cross that bridge. There's an actual bridge that links Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, to crush the Bahraini uprising. It was the Saudi forces and Gulf state forces backed by the United States that crushed the uprising in Bahrain, while at the same time telling us that we are supporting the uprisings in Libya, Syria, Egypt, etc. Yemen, similarly, the United States and Saudis intervened in Yemen against the uprising. So you have an extremely complex picture that we need to all the time not follow the way the news headlines are engineered to direct our sympathies towards problems to do with human rights. If I don't know what I know, I would be the first person to go onto the streets asking Britain to intervene in Syria to save the Syrian people. Because this is what I'm supplied with in terms of information. They appeal to our hearts, to our conscience, to our sympathy with children, with people going hungry or deprived or bombed or brutalized. But really, ultimately, the practical activities of the United States in the region, using also Israel in the region, is ultimately anti-democratic, anti-human rights, and will lead to even greater disasters and maybe even to a world war in the long run. I'm sorry to be pessimistic in that sense, but the source of optimism that I always hold on to is that people learn from their own experiences, and that what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt is not closed chapters, that the people there, despite the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood as major forces, the people there have very strong democratic organizations, working class movements, student movements, women organizations, and these forces will re-emerge, will not this sort of attempt to impose new types of darkness on the Middle East as a result of the so-called Arab Spring will, I think, eventually fail, because there are all sorts of contradictions in these societies, and people's activities, women's role, the youth of the region, and so on, are seeking solutions to complex problems. And I don't think neither these regimes nor their backers will be able to stem this historic tide. Thank you very much.
Lots of questions to ask Sami. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.